Hey guys, welcome to the Daily Word Bible Study, a plain and simple book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse study through the entire Bible. We're starting a brand new study in the Gospel of Luke, and it's going to be an exciting study. And of course, I shouldn't say that. Well, all of the books are exciting. And again, as we go through the different books, and as you go, and if you do a study and read all the books of the Bible, each book you will benefit as God intended from all of the books. In other words, each book, and here's kind of a clue when you're reading the Bible. Let the book itself tell you what its purpose is. Now, as you know, this study here is a very plain and simple study. We do not really get into a lot of theological issues. If you all note, I don't quote men. Why would I quote men when we're actually studying the actual Bible? I believe that every one of us can read, understand God's word as God intended, as God gave it and intended for it to be read and understood. So each book has its purpose. And as we are in this section, we're studying the Gospels. When we get to John, John is going to be a different gospel that we're going to greatly benefit from the revelation. Now, Luke's gospel, and I'm only going to say this: there's always theological discussions or debate from scholars, okay, in terms of the authenticity of the writer. So, for example, there's a whole debate whether or not if Luke actually wrote it. I don't get into those kind of discussions. One, I'm not qualified. I'm not a scholar. So I just don't. And then you could go if you have a good study Bible, and you look at the notes, you can see those discussions, and you can see why. And usually they will have, well, what is the internal evidence, and then they will also have from church history, you know, the pros and cons. Like I say, I don't get into that. We will just accept the fact that Luke wrote the gospel. Okay. Here's an interesting fellow because out of the four gospels, okay, two of the gospels are written by apostles. So Matthew and John, okay, and then Luke wasn't an apostle. So Luke was a Jewish person. His mother's name was Mary, and and he had very close association with. I talked about this when we began, Mark. That um, Mark grew up privileged in the sense of how just if you think about everybody came to his house. His mother Mary was, again, everybody came to her house. Um, so from that perspective, it was happening at Mary's house. So Luke, on the other hand, he has an incredible story that you can say out of the four gospels, three are from Jewish writers, and then Luke is a Gentile writer. So two of the gospels are written by apostles, and then one is an associate, a close associate of the apostles. Which, one more note, when you get into church history, so the church history is the period of time after the death of the last surviving apostle, the Apostle John. And that in church history, it is called the age of the church fathers. Okay. And the term the church fathers were those church leaders that one of the things that they did, that they accomplished during this period of time, was deciphering, establishing the true writings of the apostles versus there were a lot of fake, just like we have to deal with today. They dealt with it back then. People who claim to be an apostle, claim to be among the apostles. So you had writings there. And one of the accomplishments of the church fathers was, okay, are these writings authentic or from the apostles themselves? Or like Mark, like Luke, how would they accept a writing as canonical? How would they accept the writing as authentic? One of the tests was, in the case of Mark and Luke, did they have any kind of close association with any of the apostles? And in the case of Mark and in the case of Luke, both did. Okay, so then you could see the continuity of their writings. Some of the other writings, which people may say, well, there are a lot of writings out there, the lost books, and that the church was afraid, to include these books in the canon of Scripture, because they will discredit Christianity or something like that. That's not why they did that. They rejected certain books because they didn't meet the test. So, for example, imagine if I write a book on John F. Kennedy, right? He's a very beloved president. And what if I wrote a book and said, well, John Kennedy secretly conspired, with Russia to overthrow America, right? Well, look, okay, so right away, you would think that's absurd. But it's absurd because there is absolutely no evidence. I'm writing it, but there's absolutely no evidence. So that's why that statement would be rejected. You have news coverings today, and one of the problems with social media is, and also news media, in a rush to put out information, we're living in the days they don't even care if it's false. They don't even care. And so if you have fact checkers, this is what you would do. You would say, okay, is this information true? So Luke was a Gentile, and he one of his associations was with the Apostle Paul. And he wrote the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, which in and of itself is interesting because when you look at the Acts of the Apostles, you start in Jerusalem and then you go outside of Jerusalem. So you go beyond the 12 apostles, and through the Apostle Paul, you see the spread of the not only Christianity, but the gospel itself, so the writings. And Luke was right there with Paul in his travels. And so Luke was an eyewitness of the Apostle Paul. In his travels, they would come across, like Mark, all of the apostles, all of the associates of the apostles, so people who were with the apostles, people who knew the apostles, family members, things like that. So one of the things we're going to see is that in Luke's gospel, his writing is from a Gentile perspective, unlike Matthew, whose writings was from a Jewish perspective. So in Matthew's gospel, remember, we had more sightings of the Old Testament prophecy concerning Jesus, validating and establishing that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. Luke will not have as many Old Testament sightings. So Luke's gospel also, we would say, is from an investigative reporter. And if you, any credible investigation or investigative reporters, they gather their facts, they talk to people, they talk to witnesses, and and then they gather their information, and then they compile their story, and then of course they write the story. And so, in a sense, this is what Luke did in his Gospels. So when you compare the difference in the stories, I should say, when we compare the difference in the stories. So like Matthew might have told something in general. So we do that all the time. Like, how was your day? It was fine. I went to work and I finished a project, and that's it, right? But obviously there's more details to your day. Now Luke is going to give us more details. Luke's accounting would be more orderly. So in other words, how it happened. So here's a good example. The Sermon on the Mount. Matthew's chapters 5, 6, and 7 were a compilation of stories that Luke joined together. Okay, and we're going to see in Luke, we're going to see each of those stories as it happened or as Jesus taught it. Okay, so let's get into the Gospel of Luke. So, verse 1. Now, again, we're going to see almost the same opening when we get to the book of Acts. So he says, verse 1, many have undertaken to compile a narrative about the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as the original eyewitnesses and servants of the word handed them down to us. It also seems good to me, since I have carefully investigated everything from the very first, to write to you in an orderly sequence, most honorable Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things about which you have been instructed. Now, let's work our way backwards here. We don't know exactly who this Theophilus is, but he seems to be a dignitary, most honorable Theophilus. And so this is who Luke is writing the Gospel and Acts to. So again, here's the Gentile. And so somewhere in the Roman world, he's writing this. So Theophilus is going to be reading this, events that happened in Jerusalem. Now, believe it or not, Christianity during this time wasn't the major religion. It was a growing religion. You could say it was taking the world by storm. Okay, its expansion through faith, through the preaching of the gospel, producing faith. So now, like when you look at the numbers of Christianity, of Christians today, that they number somewhere around the neighborhood of maybe 2.4 billion people. 1.4 billion of that is Catholics. Now, but that's religious side. And within that number, you have a mixture of people who just name the name of Christ versus those who are actual born again believers. During this time, though, you had probably the majority of those naming the name of Christ who were actually born again believers. And one reason is that the Roman world wasn't that friendly to Christians during this time. And there was a lot of wild things. It was said that, for example, Nero, that I think he set fire to, I think, parts of Rome and then blamed the Christians. And as well, there were a lot of, again, there were just a lot of false stories about Christianity. People who hated Christianity, the Pharisees, but not only the Pharisees, remember, were Luke is writing to, was probably more Roman than anything else. So you had a lot, and there were a lot of people that were irritated by Christianity. There was even one story where Christians, I mean, the Romans called Christians atheists. And the reason why is because they had one God, right? Whereas the Romans had many gods. So that's, again, very interesting. During this time, Christianity wasn't the dominant religion. Today, Christianity is the dominant religion. Pretty much everybody knows about Christianity. Even in Muslim world, they know about Christianity. And certainly when you think about Europe, United States, many of those nations where it is even not only the dominant religion, but the dominant thought. Okay. Now, kind of interesting, just on a sidebar, like if you was to go to a Muslim nation, even though people know about Christianity, Christianity is not necessarily the dominant thought. Islam is. Same thing if you go to nations that is dominated by Hinduism. I mean, these are large religions, okay? They have millions of people, hundreds of millions of people. So at this time, Christianity wasn't the dominant thought, so it was a growing religion. It was one of these things that people was like, well, what is going on here? And many people were coming to faith. And as you can see, this dignitary had come to faith, and Luke is writing him exactly what this story is. And of course, now God is in his purpose would also be the stories for us. Now, you will look, he says, many have undertaken to compile a narrative about the events that have been fulfilled among us. Now, notice again, many have undertaken to compile this a narrative. So that could be a good thing and not so much of a good thing, because the many here, and depending on who is compiling the narrative, could be either right or wrong. This seemed to be more positive, that the people who are writing the narrative, he is saying, and notice verse 2, he said, just as the original eyewitnesses and servants of the word handed them down to us. So just let us know Luke wasn't an apostle. You can see that he is getting information from, now get this, and this is important, the original eyewitnesses. So the apostles, the 12 apostles, were eyewitnesses of Jesus' ministry, Jesus' glory, Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, and ascension into heaven. They were eyewitnesses. Now, at this point, this is important for us as Christians. Notice he said, just as original eyewitnesses and servants of the word handed them down to us. Okay? It's important to understand that when we talk about our faith, why is our faith so important? Why is it that our faith, okay, when people, and they do criticize us today, they criticize us for following fables, okay? They criticize us for following myth. And is that true? And notice what Luke is saying here. that, again, from a reporter perspective, notice he says, I've investigated. Look at verse 3. It seems good to me. I have carefully investigated everything from the first to write to you. Watch it in an orderly sequence. So here's how our faith is built upon. Here you have Luke carefully investigating, talking to the original eyewitnesses. So not just people who are just making up a story. So when you think about every other religion, watch this, every other religion, what are the eyewitness accounts for them? Now, in some cases, they're actual people. You could say that, for example, Islam, Muhammad was an actual historic figure. But so what are the true stories versus the not true stories about Muhammad? Now, some of the other religions, right? What are the facts about this? And then I will say this: how are these facts ever discredited? In other words, can you say that there were people at the time that if you were to examine them to be able to say, here is credible witness to say that Luke and them made this up. Peter, James, John made this up. They lied, okay? Or they were crooks. They were swindlers, okay? All right, we're going to continue this in the next lesson, next study, I should say, because I think this is important too, as far as I think this is important that we kind of understand this, because we face this kind of criticism today about our faith, that it's just kind of a myth. And while I will definitely say our faith is just that, it is a faith. The Bible is a book of faith, not science, a book of faith. And I'll get more into that in the next study. Don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comment section below. All comments are welcome. And I will see you in the next study.